We're going to devote our energies to sports and gardening, all the cultural pursuits as far as they're concerned. In fact, we're going to put the goons to sleep. Meanwhile, we dig.
Greetings and welcome to the Anadromist. This is Burn Power coming to you in the early evening, midsummer in Tbilisi, Georgia. Where is that? It's in the Caucasus Mountains. Where else? And speaking of the Caucasus, remember, I am still looking for a few more people, less than a handful, to come to the gathering in Georgia, and information will be forthcoming around here somewhere. But why? What's going on today? Well, sorry. Why are yawns contagious? That's a very interesting subject. And you could say, and they are contagious, but there's no specifically physical reason for them being contagious. It is a kind of human social contagion. And you hear the word social contagion more lately in reference to certain kinds of almost tribal, cultish political ideologies. But the idea of social contagion is much wider than that. So what I thought I would do, I've just had these thoughts running around in my head, and I thought I would give you a few of them. And they're not all deeply worked out. They're more preliminary thoughts. But nevertheless, I think the concept of social contagion is worth thinking about. Now, if you've been on this channel before, you know that I've dealt with propaganda quite a bit. And I see a direct correlation between propaganda and social contagion, which I'll give you my idea on that a little bit later in the episode. But let's go ahead and unravel these things. Before we do, though, you should like the channel to help the algorithm. Frankly, the algorithms hate my guts because I'm inconsistent. And what I mean by that is that I'm not doing the same kind of thing all the time. I'm not doing a measurable kind of thing. So I might get a video that has several thousand viewers, and then do an interview with someone no one knows, and then give an update, and then tackle a subject that has nothing that anyone is searching for. And so as a result, it means the channel is kind of staying in a certain place, and I'd rather it not. So I'm coming up with an idea about that, and I think the idea is I'm eventually going to start the channel that will get the views, that will maybe just put something once a month that'll be more, I don't know if it will be more polished, but it will be more focused. It'll be the kind of videos people really like that I do, and which really take a lot of work. Meanwhile, I feel this need to communicate with everyone, and even if it's not nearly as many as, if I have 4,000 people who watch the Rookmacher lecture, almost 5,000 by now, I would say I've got 300 to 500 real regular viewers, but you guys are quality. So share the videos, like them. I mean, if I'm doing something you like, just like it. It's not about whether I see it or not. It's about whether this gets spread or not. And every little bit of engagement helps. And people have asked, why isn't the channel growing? I just told you. So there you are. In order for it to grow, I have to put out consistent content. But consistent content can get to be inhuman. And I don't like being inhuman. So what I'm going to do is put the consistent content, the stuff I know people will click on, in one place. And then that will grow, and maybe there'll be feedback here. I'll keep this as it is, with the exception of some of the bigger series. And I will finish up the Cute and the Creepy series here. Although I may also do a version of it that I'll start spreading into the bigger world. One hopes. And you can support the channel because... my base is small. It takes time to do these, and I think to myself, should I still be doing these or not? You can let me know if I should by supporting the channel. That is very helpful. And coming up very soon, I am going to do something like a marathon as a fundraiser for getting my stuff to Europe. I went to the tax people and I found a company who will bring the stuff here, and now I'm looking at $10,000 plus to do it all. $10,000 beyond what I've got. So that will be coming up, and you should think about it. Okay, so enough of this stuff. Evidently I have a channel with almost no social contagion. Back to the idea of social contagion. Yawning. Why is it contagious? Well, the best theory that we have is that it has something to do with empathy. That when a person yawns, we register this fact, and then we yawn with them. Now, as far as the way that works, it's on a very deep level, almost unconscious level. I mean, you can, in the presence of yawning people, try to fight it off. It's very hard. Because it's something inside of us that's connecting, saying something like, I feel you, you're sleepy, I'm sleepy too, see? And that's I think, the best idea of what we have when people are yawning. Another socially contagious kind of basic contagion that we have is, well, let me just play you this clip. It's laughing. Let me play you this clip. See if you can resist the urge to laugh with this clip. Just go along with me for a minute. Guy is just crazy. Now, there are some gurus who do this laughing thing. And did the guy start this whole... Does he know how to kick laughing off? See, that's the weirder thing about laughing, is that it can... Well, a comedian can make people laugh. A person like that, if that guy is doing that laughter to get other people to laugh, that was very successful. If he was just naturally laughing... But whatever it is, once you start getting into that mode of laughter, it's very hard to quit. I'm sure you've all had those evenings where you're just with your friends, you're sitting around telling stories or even jokes, and after a while, everything makes you laugh. And I'm not talking about being stoned, that kind of thing. That doesn't even count, because that's like a whole other thing. Or being drunk even. I'm talking about just everything strikes you as funny. And that's when the contagion of laughter takes over. And sometimes you can't stop it even if you want to. Actors have this problem when they get the giggles during a set and they just keep laughing, even though they know they have to stop. There's a famous story Peter Sellers tells about... Actually, let me play you that story. It's really...
Who are the other great gigglers, Peter, that you know about? Well, there's a lot of them in the business. O'Toole, Peter O'Toole is a notorious giggler. He Oh, yes. When he was making Lawrence of Arabia, do you ever remember the scene, Lawrence of Arabia, where King Faisal, played by Alec Guinness, welcomed Peter O'Toole and Anthony Quayle into his tent to listen to a passage read from the Quran? They'd ridden through the desert. Now, O'Toole usually likes to have, or used to like to have anyway, a bit of the old shampoo in the morning, and to sort of warm up. And Anthony Quayle is pretty straight-faced. Actually, he was once described, obviously very wrongly, by John Gielgud as having a face like 2 tins of condemned veal. Which is a rather cruel way, but I mean, you know what I mean? It's a sort of image. And he never broke up, you see, but O'Toole was breaking up continuously. And the problem was this. As they came into the tent, Guinness would say, and David Lean's a stickler for reality, And they were filming in the middle of the desert. Now, the scene was that Peter came into the tent with Anthony Quayle, and they sat down, and Peter was having this terrible bout of giggles because a dear old actor, God rest his soul, who's passed by now, Henry Oscar, was playing Selim. This is a story told by Peter O'Toole to me. Couldn't remember the Quran, you see. I mean, there's masses of it, and he was quoting a section called The Brightness. And Alex said, welcome, Orans, welcome to my tent. Sit down. We're just in time to hear Selim quote from The Brightness. Selim, give us the brightness. Now, this had happened several times, and eventually, after 15 takes, Guinness, who'd been absolutely straight all this way, Alec Guinness said, Gentlemen, we are all professionals, for God's sake. Let us remember we are professionals. So David Lean said, look, let's all cut for about 10 minutes. Let's go out, have a smoke, walk around the tent. They were in the middle of the desert with lights inside the tent, on top of the heat already. You can imagine what it was like. Henry Oscar's beard that was stuck on with spirit gum was coming off in the edges. And he was getting very nervous by this time, you see. So they start to walk around the tent outside, and O'Toole's saying to himself, like we all do when these things happen, I must not laugh, I will not laugh, I cannot laugh. It's the end of my career. If I laugh again, I'm dead. I must not laugh, I will not laugh, I cannot laugh. Alec Guinness has another walk. Alec Guinness walks like that. He says, I hope they don't laugh. David Lean says, okay, let's have another go. Now, O'Toole said, I must not laugh, I will not laugh, you see. And Guinness says, David Lean says, action. In comes O'Toole, and Guinness says, welcome, Orans, welcome. We were just listening to Selim quoting from the Quran, from a selection called The Brightness. Please sit down with Captain so-and-so and listen. And now, and he turned round to Henry Oscar, who was all glued up and everything, and he said, and now, Selim, give us the...
So, Peter Sellers tells this story about these people just can't stop themselves from laughing, which I think is an amazing thing. The contagion of laughing. It's really a social contagion. But it's not a social contagion in the way some other things are that we'll talk about. Nevertheless, to be induced to laugh can sometimes mean to be induced to laugh at the wrong things. Now, this isn't going to be a discussion on humor. Are there wrong things to laugh at? I think so. And of course, it depends on time, culture, many other things. But we'll leave that there for now. So one of the ideas that's kind of vaguely connected to this social contagion, whatever it is, it involves behavior and emotions or conditions spreading spontaneously through a group. They can be induced. And that's an important thing to remember, these ideas. It's a bit like the idea of memes. I don't mean memes by your little picture. It's unfortunate that we use the word meme to describe all the funny little pictures that people put captions on, because that is like the most minimal layer of memes. Memes is also related to the idea of being mimetic, of imitating others. Imitate. So mimetic, imitate, copying the behavior of others. And memes are interesting here because we find, for instance, why were so many people at the beginning of the 20th century, end of the 19th century, why were so many people during that period trying to find a way to fly? Well, that was mimetic activity. People were saying, this is the next thing to do. We need to do it. It's the same thing that happened when social media suddenly came around. There were a few examples like MySpace and other sites. I can't remember all the early ones off the top of my head right now, but if you know, you can fill in the gaps. But eventually you got to Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and YouTube. And all of these were social media, and they spread. Are they social contagion? No, I don't think so. I think they are platforms that can certainly contain social contagion. There is a problem in our society with the atomized individual. That is to say, we don't find ourselves generally circling around families, clan structures, even your friends in school. It's amazing. In America, this is true. Now, this isn't true in other cultures, but in America, you eventually split off from everyone. You know, and I've seen this happen over and over. When I used to live in New York City, people would come there for one reason or another, often to start working on their art or their career. And so they would get to know people who were doing the same things. But what I noticed, having lived there 16 years, is about the middle of that period, with the exception of the people born and raised in New York, who are a separate breed, everyone else who I knew who came there eventually would leave. So I remember having a really interesting dinner with a group of people. I was experimenting with forms of conviviality through dinners and feasts. And I did it a couple years after that and a couple more years after that. And there were only one or two people who were at two of the three events, and no one who was at all three. Even though, had they been there, I would have invited them, because they left. We lived this strange, atomized existence. Also, people today, it's like they'll just stop hanging out with each other if someone believes the wrong thing, which I can understand, wanting to be around people that think like you, but it's a really, what shall we say, anemic form of life. It is bloodless. It keeps everyone with their own in-jokes, but it's not a real community. It's not a real family. It's not something that holds people together. And most of us have this idea that we understand our own psychology. And I know in the West, in America in particular, but also in the Anglosphere, all the different English-speaking countries, Australia, Canada, New Zealand, the US, Britain, we have this idea that we understand ourselves and no one else can tell us who we are. And I think it's worst, of course, in America, because that is our raison d'etre, to be ourselves, to follow that dream, to follow the star, to don't dream it, be it. And so what we are is we're all these self-contained, isolated individuals who think we control what we think and do. And we have a little bit of information about psychology, a little bit, just enough to make us think we know something, not enough to help us. And what we don't realize is there's something else out there. While we're thinking about our own, in America, it's all self-help things. And I've seen the self-help ethos travel across the globe further and further. And we think we understand ourselves. We're looking for ourselves. We're trying to find ourselves. Or as Jackie Mason once says, I'm looking for myself. I knew where I once was. Maybe I should go there. But will I be there if I go there? It's just like this idea that the self is someone else that we're looking for. But what we don't take into consideration is crowd psychology, mass psychology. Jacques Ellul uses the phrase alone in the mass to describe what he calls the perfect, what he says is the most favorable moment to seize a man and influence him is when he is alone in the mass. It is at this point that propaganda can be most effective. Jacques Ellul says this in his book, Propaganda, among many other things. If you really want to understand the concepts of propaganda that I've been using, you must read that book, because people will say, you should read Edward Bernays. I'm going like, no, the guy was a propagandist. I mean, I've got books by Joseph Goebbels, too. Yeah, I can learn something about how to create propaganda and manipulate people, but you need someone who is actually outside of the system to really pull it apart. And Jacques Ellul is the man, and Propaganda is the book. Anything before that, I don't want to read books by propagandists trying to propagandize me. I want to read books by someone who, with tongs, is holding this fissionable material. And one of the things I've come to realize is that in crowd psychology, see, there are people who spend, like Edward Bernays, who spend their whole lives in advertising, in PR, in working to figure out how to put spin on the news. Their whole job is to understand crowd psychology. And we often tend to feel we're not a part of the crowd psychology. But, oh yeah, we all are. And it's not until you understand that you can even begin to find a way out of it. So a lot of us think that just by asserting the self, you will somehow, be that person, be authentic. And you don't realize you are encircled. But propaganda is one thing, and it's always there. But it feeds upon social contagion. One way to look at it is propaganda is to social contagion what the mafia was to prohibition. Prohibition was, the act of American Congress to make it a law that you could no longer buy or sell alcohol, with a few exceptions. This was this noble ideal. Itself, perhaps, the result of some kind of social contagion among the early feminists, who were the ones who promoted it, and the women's movement, who wanted to get the men out of the bars and such. Laudable goal. Men do spend too much time in bars. But the mafia came along and exploited that fact. It created the speakeasies, the places where you could go in the underworld. It created this environment of lawlessness because it was such a ridiculous law that no one could actually live up to it. And so the mafia exploited the hypocrisy of it. Well, that's how propaganda works in a much larger sense on and with social contagions. Let me just give you a few examples I've been thinking about social contagions. One of them is there are economic bubbles. Economic bubbles are a strange thing because suddenly people are all spending their money because they think, I'm of the opinion that people do almost anything because they think it will provide some sort of answer or meaning or telos to their lives. It'll provide a purpose. It'll provide something that they don't have. I think that's also how we enter into human relationships as well. And there's a good aspect to that. And then there is the mafia and prohibition. There are the vultures circling almost everything. So economic bubbles are when, the Dutch Tulip Mania. Suddenly, people in 17th century Netherlands, which was doing fantastically well financially, it was the golden age of the Netherlands. It's when all the great art was done. It was when they sailed the seas, and they were colonizers, but they were also, they believed in free speech. Hans Rookmacher often says he's very proud of the fact that Descartes, whom he totally disagrees with, was published in Amsterdam because there was freedom of thought there, even though he couldn't be published in his own France. So this was a very interesting time in Dutch history. And yet this strange thing happened where people started buying up tulips. Now, some people have said it wasn't as big as McKay's book on the madness of crowds suggests, but it doesn't matter. It went around. And what seems to have happened was that there was a kind of a disease which would inflict certain changes on the genetic structure of tulips to provide, instead of the solid colors of red or yellow or something like that, into these odd color mixtures. And people went nuts for these. They started speculating and buying them. And this really caused economic turmoil because of the way people were speculating on these. They were looking at them as a form of social currency, but it was certainly social contagion. There was another scheme that developed in Scotland called the Darien scheme. Anyone who's ever tried to travel from North America to South America by car knows you can't. There is a place in Panama and Colombia called the Darien Gap. And this gap is unpassable. It's just, and there isn't the will to do something tremendously technological down there, to build some sort of hyper road through this basically malaria-infested swamp. So the Scots, I believe this was in the early 18th century, late 17th century, came up with this idea to all invest in this area, because they could see what the people who later built the Panama Canal could see of how valuable this area was in terms of being a place. And they weren't thinking in terms of a canal, but they were thinking like, ooh, look how thin it is there. If we controlled that passage, boats could save weeks and months by stopping there, unloading their freight, moving it across the country, and then other boats waiting for them. And then they wouldn't have to go around Cape Horn, which is one of the most deadly sailing lanes in the world. The only problem was no one knew anything about the Darien Gap. They thought, there's some jungles and stuff, but we'll just go down there and set it up. We're Scots, we can conquer it. We live in the Highlands, right? We're going to go down there and we're going to manage this property. Nope. They went down there and died, essentially. And here's the point. They captured an absolutely staggering amount of money for their project. So much so that when the project failed, it bankrupted Scotland and forced them to essentially sell their independence to England. And that was kind of like the last time Scotland was really independent, because they'd fallen for this strange fever dream about a place no one knew anything about. That someone had this idea that we're going to go there and we're going to control the shipping lanes of the world. Like I said, if they'd been thinking the Panama Canal, which was a difficult place to build a canal by itself, but nothing like the Darien Gap. Look it up sometime just look up the Darien Gap and be afraid. But also the American real estate bubble that led to the 2008 crash was a similar kind of social contagion. Banks were offering cheap interest. They weren't turning people away. People were just simply going, yes, I want property. Yes. Poor people who couldn't really afford it suddenly saw, oh, this is so cheap now. If I buy some small thing. No, took everybody with it. And not just America, but all over the world was affected by this strange social thing. You can see this again in something crazy like the Beanie Babies. This stupid little bean doll I think that was the late 90s, or was it Cabbage Patch Dolls, which was another one. Was suddenly these things would become these weird collectible dolls, and they would make them to be collectible, would become worth hundreds and hundreds of dollars. And so people would be buying them, hoping to get one that would be valuable in the near future. Everyone thinks of these things in the near future. And yet, no, it didn't work. There was another bubble that burst. These economic bubbles are often social contagions. But here's an even stranger one. There is this thing called spiritualism. It's sometimes also called spiritism. There's actually a church dedicated to this in America. I don't know, you can call it a denomination, but it's some sort of religious entity. Now, what's weird is, in the late 18th century, there were some people who were coming up with these kind of odd ideas. One of them was Emanuel Swedenborg, who had come up with ideas about material reality. Also, there were concepts like animal magnetism. Now, I'm just throwing these words out here, and I'm not trying. I know a bit more about them that I'm going to tell you, but I'm not. The point of this is not to go off to talk about them. The point of this is to talk about what happened with this set of beliefs as a social contagion. One of the people who was a follower of Swedenborg. There's actually a Swedenborgian church, by the way, just saying that. It was a guy named Franz Mesmer. Now, the word mesmer may set off a bell or two. Mesmer, we get the word mesmerism, to be mesmerized, to be essentially hypnotized. And indeed, he is the guy who first started getting kind of opening up this door to the concept of hypnotism. Now, his ideas spread into the early 19th century, spread to America, and started to enter. There was a second Great Awakening, it was called. The first Great Awakening in America was during the later part of the 18th century in America, particularly after the American Revolution. But then there was a second Great Awakening, which happened, let's just say for now, in the 1840s. And it was particularly strong in upstate New York. And upstate New York had so many different revivals and camp meetings and religious seeking and such, that it was called, during the time, it was called the Burned Over District. Burned over. Because it had, essentially the fire of God had come over this so many times, all that was left was, burnt out husks of spiritual movements. Interestingly enough, these ideas of Mesmer, which involve magnets and involve hypnotism and involve touching people in strange ways and such, eventually came into this area. One of the major American sects, cults that started during this period was Mormonism. And it was definitely a product post-Mesmer. And that is to say, because Joseph Smith got his revelations through peep stones. What are peep stones, you might ask? There's some kind of thing you use like glasses that are stones that you can't see through. So the whole point was to enter some sort of weird alpha state and to get some sort of message from beyond. Well, there were other movements as well. The Unitarians were doing quite well in this movement. And in fact, a lot of this Second Great Awakening overlapped with two other movements at the same time. There were Christians who did quite well out of it. I believe this was the time that the Jehovah's Witnesses started going as well. But here's the important thing. The two other movements that were doing well, one was the New England version of Romanticism, reform movements, and the other through some kind of edgy Quakers and such. Edgy Quakers, it's the idea of edgy Quakers is kind of funny to me, because they're never edgy. But at this time, there were some kind of edgy Quakers who were, but it was also connected to the abolitionist movement. So this was very hard to pull apart what was connected, especially with what was about to take off from this movement. In upstate New York, there were a couple of sisters, the Fox sisters. There were actually three of them, but two of them were the ones who started this. They started doing seances and they claimed that the spirits were contacting them, and they would do, oh wait, if anyone is there, contact me. And they would do this. And eventually they had a whole repertoire of things that were supposed to happen. They were taken to some sort of radical Quakers place by their friends and family. And they demonstrated this for these reform-minded people. So this was like the New Age movement of the times. And suddenly all these people were like, yes, this is what we've been looking for. Later out of the same movement, down the road, you would get Christian Science as well, but that's a further development. But suddenly, seances and rappings and tables and all this stuff was the order of the day. And there was even a group called the Davenport Brothers who took this thing on the road. A lot of tricks with ropes and escaping and such, which may strike the name Harry Houdini in your mind, and it's totally connected. And in fact, Harry Houdini went out of his way. He knew a lot of the history of what I'm telling you about, and of course much more, but he went out of his way to expose mediums. He would go to places looking for mediums, always hoping to communicate with his dead mother, whom he loved dearly. And at one point, there would be, like when Harry Houdini was at a seance, they would say, your mother is trying to contact you. And she would say, Harry, and, be speaking in English. And then he would go like, my mother didn't speak English. And he would always point out the fraud. And in fact, these things were genuinely fraudulent. One of the sisters, Margareta, who'd started this with her sister, other sister Leah, in 1848, eventually in 1888 confessed that it was all tricks and that she had been doing this. Where did the tricks come from? See mesmerism, see hypnotism, see this movement that had sprouted as a result of these things. But anyway, she actually went public with it and did a public demonstration where her sister was still claiming this was real, and then she would get the exact same effects and say, you see, you've all been duped. I can do all of these effects without actually connecting with spirits. And yet it just went on and on and on. And even though she confessed, the movement didn't stop because it became a social contagion. It spread everywhere. And interestingly enough, it spread through the upper and upper middle classes mostly. Poor people weren't going to seances. It was people with money. Whenever you see some movie with a seance, it's always like some people very respectable, clothing, very Edwardian, late Victorian, dressed up and trying to connect the spirits. And there's also a lot of strange ideology connected with these things. So how did this strange, what to me would have seemed pretty obvious that it would have been a trick of some sort. Nevertheless, it convinced so many people. And how did it spread? Well, it spread the way many things spread. Walker Percy, in his book Lost in the Cosmos, talks about fashion. And he says, try to imagine the mindset of people who would start binding feet as they did in China. Or the strange things that happen as a result of some movie star suddenly wearing a certain kind of clothing, or some rock star, or some well-known person. And he says, the authority of the trendsetter is what is most important in this kind of social contagion. He was talking mostly about the social contagions of fashion, but this can be applied across the board. So spiritualism spread because it had its own form of seductive celebrities. One of the most interesting ones was this woman, Cora L.W. Scott, who ended up, in the course of her life, changing her names 4 or 5 times. At one point it was Hatch, Cora Hatch, Tappan. I think she ended with Cora Richmond. And these were all husbands she had married, which kind of tells you something right there. But the point is this: when she was young, she was this very beautiful Victorian woman with like ringlets and just this, you would get the feeling if you were there. I don't know if we could even convey it, but of her being this almost unearthly person. There's something about tapping into some people who are beautiful, tapping into celebrities, tapping into people. This is why Hollywood movie stars are listened to when they never should be. These people are as lost as anyone, perhaps more, because they don't even know who they are half the time. They just wanted to be seen, which is the most dangerous thing in the world. And which is how so much travels today through TikTok or, whatever social media. The idea of wanting to be seen. Selfies are just this nightmarish thing that we've unleashed, to the point where people, get plastic surgery based on trying to create a perfect face for a selfie. And oddly enough, that's a perfect face facing forward, but not sideways, because who sees themselves sideways? So there's kinds of fat, it's called buccal fat, that they're trying to get removed from their face. They're trying to get their jaws sculpted. So they say that there's actually a selfie face now. And what they mean by that is not the kind of like, that duck face thing. They're saying that the faces have changed because people are now looking down, holding their faces a certain way for poses, and it's changing their jaw shapes to give it a kind of open mouth kind of quality. Like, I should get the laughing guy back here again. Let's do it. See if you can not laugh this time. This is social contagion through the authority, through the celebrity, through the use of beautiful people. And everybody does this. Every group wants to prove that its people are more beautiful, that we have better people with us. And as Solzhenitsyn said, you don't. The line between good and evil runs down everyone, including all those people you think are really great. So spiritualism continues to this day, although much lessened. I am thankful to God for Harry Houdini running around and exposing these frauds. And because it's the worst kind of thing. It is taking magic tricks, essentially, and using them to give people very false hope about the state of their dead relatives. I mean, imagine someone who's lost a 10-year-old child comes to one of these and wants to communicate with it, and this person has the audacity to try to imitate the child. Now, some of these people were actually really great theatrically, and that isn't a good thing. That's a bad thing, because what it means is they are able to convince people. And there are people today who do mentalism. And some say, well, this is just a trick. Others of them will basically say, I have powers. Uri Geller did that in the 1970s with his spoon bending things. And he basically would imply that it was caused by him, whereas it was a trick and it could be replicated by other people. Drug addiction is a weird social contagion. Now, I'm not going to talk about all the different kinds of drugs. I'm just going to talk about heroin in particular right now. And the reason is because it's such a huge subject, and you could be here all night, and you can think of your own stories. And in fact, with any of these, have you been involved with social contagion at all? Have you been infected? Have you, I have certainly gone through periods in my own life where, not the early Jesus people days, but the later Jesus people days, the second part, definitely some contagion going on there. In New York City, by the time I got through La Brea, I was very, what can I say, adverse to social contagion. I had learned how to see through it. And I think for the most part, I've kept clear of it since I was about 25 years old. But that isn't to say I don't feel the effects of it. We all do. But heroin is a very strange thing. Why would heroin use spread? Everyone knows that the withdrawal symptoms from heroin are terrifying. Everyone knows this. This isn't like a mystery. And yet, it goes on. And it's connected to things later, like the opioid epidemic. But in New York City, I would see people, you could always tell when they had first gotten their shot, because they would walk down the street really, really slowly. And there are a couple of things going on here. One of the things that is not talked about in anti-heroin discussions is how good it feels. It is, I consider it like debt management. You put everything you have into this one thing, and it makes you feel so good. And you haven't got a care in the world. Of course, it makes it difficult to work, which means it's going to be difficult to get more money, and especially for the people on the street. Eventually Nick Cave had done heroin for years, and when I first heard of him, a friend of mine had spent some time with him saying, he was just totally twisted out of his mind on heroin for these shows that he was doing, which were really violent and intense. But he just kept doing it over and over and over until he developed a kind of, I wouldn't want to say, he wasn't immune to the effects, but he was like managing the effects. He gotten to the point where he just needed a certain amount to manage the effects, which he had to stop that. But when I say that this went on and on and on, I mean like 10, 15, 20 years went on and on and on. And there were moments he talks about in his book, Faith, Hope, and Carnage, which I really recommend. He talks about when suddenly he's like in Paris or something, and he can't bring any drugs in with him, and suddenly he doesn't have any, and he can't do the maintenance thing, and how frightened he'd get because he knows what's on the other end of it. But here's the big question: why do people get hooked on this? Why does it spread? What in it? And here's the weird thing about heroin. Everyone knows that it's messy and dark and you end up smelling and, your life is under the control of this thing. And you will never get the initial rush quite again. But you'll buy more to get that rush. But here's the point. It is the darkness of it that is contagious. It is, many people feel themselves so disassociated, so alienated from the people around them, that something like this appeals because it just says, this is who I am. I'm this really, truly alienated person. Because if you're a junkie, you have drawn a line in the sand to the rest of the world saying like, yeah, I just don't give a fuck. I mean, I'd like to, but what's the point? And it spreads. The opioid addiction thing went on and on and on. I mean, my poor mother was given oxycodone and then just given a sheet of it. They never told me about it. They gave her the sheet, and she came back from Seattle, where she'd been convalescing from an operation for a month or so. And they gave her the sheet, and I met her, and she was taking way too much and became her whole personality changed as a result. Because essentially it was a kind of a form of heroin addiction, but in a different kind of pattern. And then the clinic in Alaska said, no, we don't hand out that stuff, because they were smarter than that. However, the damage was already done, and she was never quite the same after that, and she only lived another 5 months. And this is, so in that case, she gets the package of the opioids as a result of the social contagion of the healthcare workers, who all believe that, okay, yeah, it's some kind of, poppy-related drug, but it should be all right if you manage it well. And how many people died as a result? I don't consider my mother's death as a direct result of that, but still, it's a nightmare that we get trapped in these, and then it spreads. Why did the opioid addiction spread? And it spread so far. And it gets worse. There's the Skoptsy movement in Russia, the Skoptsy sect, cult, which was somehow connected to the old believers, and then a spin-off of that, I think the Chlisti, who were the people who whipped themselves, and then there was a spin-off of that, and that was the Skoptsy, and they believed in what they called the baptism of fire, and the baptism of fire was self-mutilation and castration. And you would say to yourself, now, this isn't going to spread. You would be so wrong. Thousands and thousands, tens of thousands of Russians and people in the Russian Empire joined this group. And in fact, they said that they probably, there's evidence that there was still Skoptsy up until the Second World War. So starting in the early 19th century, all the way into the middle of the 20th century, there were Skoptsy. And you're saying, how could such a thing happen? And when you start to look at some of the pictures of the Skops, you start to say something to yourself, this reminds me of something else. And the something else is the trans movement. And I look at whatever is going on with the trans movement, which people are talking endlessly about, and I'm not going to go into it, because to me it's so clear it's another form of social contagion. And it's very similar to that strange desire to remove one's genitals that occurred during the Skoptsy movement. And it's somehow these things spread. I think part of it is if you see someone do something like that, there's a part of us inside that goes, wow, that's really brave. I remember in New York City when people first started getting tattoos, and I kind of consider tattoos a bit of a social contagion as well, because I think people are doing it often to express themselves, which is really weird if everyone's doing the same thing to express themselves. And it just keeps going and going, and I'm going like, what? Are you in a tribe? No. You are alone in the mass. And you're trying to identify yourself to others, so you're looking for something to put on your body. And the odd thing, of course, with tattooing is you get some image when you're in your 20s. Do you really think you'll connect with that image when you're in your 60s? Probably not. Which is why New York City, when tattooing started, suddenly had all these advertisements for tattoo removal with laser surgery. But I remember when people, it was like 1990 or so, and people were first starting to get tattooed. And it really spread first. Before it went to mainstream, it spread throughout the counterculture. And people would ask me, Bern, are you going to get tattooed? Just that question, Bern, are you going to get tattooed, is the social contagion. It is the virus trying to spread and duplicate itself. It is the mimetic quality of it trying to get into you. Well, of course, it's like good luck trying to get anything like that into me. I don't do that. It's just like, sorry, I don't follow people into their stupid behavior, except to say, I love you, and is there a way we can find a way out? Is there a way we can say, okay, you made this mistake. Nah, don't go get laser surgery. This is just who you are now. You've crossed a boundary. I'm not condemning anyone because it's become such a contagion. But this is how people originally were talking about it. I remember going into the hippest store in New York, which at the time was See Here, and it had all these fanzines, and this was before there was the internet, of course, and they had all these like self-made little magazines and stuff, homemade, stuff related to rock movements, but also stuff related to body art and all this other stuff. And they were down there, and one of the guys who's, one of the two guys who ran the place said to another person who was there, he says, are you bold enough to get a tattoo? He was talking about it in terms of boldness. And I thought to myself, that's really funny. Because I knew soon it's not going to be, are you bold enough? It's going to be like, why haven't you? But there is, even with heroin or something, there's this aspect of the courage to be completely nihilistic, the courage to be completely withdrawn from society, the courage to finally admit who you really are. And this is who you are. You're a junkie. This is who you are. You're not the body you were born into. You're another body. It's like the whole BIID, body integrity identity disorder, where, the people say things like, I really feel that I was born to have one limb cut off. And that, I'm not joking at all here. I'm not trying to say anything that's like strange. Well, it is strange, but the point is, it's like, do you have the courage to get? And they use the same language of affirming surgery. So, like I said, I'm not going to go off on the whole trans movement here, because to me it's clear it has all the evidence of being social contagion. And you can tell by the way people defend it. If this is really who you are, then it really wouldn't bother you if someone misgendered you, used your dead name. I have spent most of my life, and I've been a Christian since I was 15 years old, in places where being a Christian was completely not on the menu. And whether it was being around people who were real new agey, or whether it was being at people like in New York, performance artists and nihilistic punks and stuff, and people would talk as if Christianity was just this hellish thing, and I'm sitting there going, yeah, I'm not going to go into this right now with them, because when they're saying this, they're not speaking as themselves. They're speaking. It is the contagion speaking. It is the propaganda taking advantage of the contagion, because they don't know anything about Christianity, really. So it's much better when suddenly they realize, as this happened several times. I remember my friend Dean, he got in touch with me. He was a bass player for this band that had some pretty crazy performance art attached to it. And he just said, Bern, you're the only person no one really speaks badly about. And I considered that really high praise. because that's how I walk through everything, is I try not to be the person who's, involved in something so much that it becomes who you are. It's been interesting to me recently watching a Lauren Southern, who was such an anti-woke, anti-SJW, anti-politically correct person. And recently, she's been going through this thing. She's an interesting person. I never agreed with her when she was in her more radical phase, but I would watch her because I thought she was interesting. Even if I thought okay, that's too much. I shared enough in common to find her interesting and questioned enough to say, yeah, sometimes even good ideas can be taken way too far. But now she's kind of coming out of it, and it's very interesting to see. And you could feel that even all of the meme war and there's just so much, even on the right wing, which is just political contagion and propaganda. And many people need to come out of that to be human. Because like I said, you can call me whatever you want. And I've been called all sorts of things. And it's okay. Because, see, the point is this. You really haven't got to who I am. You can't get to who I am. Because it's not my definition. It's God's. I mean, I think we all construct ourselves to the degree we can. There is the view that other people have of me. There is the view of myself. There is the people that friends have of me versus the view that someone might have just, running into me in a supermarket checkout line. There is the view of me that you have, but none of them corresponds actually to me. Even my view of myself isn't just me. I'm not seeing the whole picture. But I do feel God does. Therefore, my definition of myself isn't based on me. And that makes me real sales resistant to social contagion. Because if you're trying to sell me something, this was one of the really good points about being in New York for 16 years. By the time I was done there, not only had I gone through L'Abri before I got there, which gave me kind of an intellectual, spiritual bulwark against, just mass delusional ideas, but learning about how to be a sales resistor in New York City. I have people come up to me sometimes and they'll say, "Don't you want to buy this?" And I look at them and go you really have no idea who you're talking to. I mean, you couldn't sell me this if you tried. Because as soon as you try, I'm immediately going, okay, what are you really getting out of this? It's that New York skepticism thing coming out, which I'm really grateful for. It can go too far, obviously. So, here is my final thought. That there are, now, in a sense, like the thing with laughing and yawning, yeah, those are social contagions, which generally aren't a problem. Although, like I said, laughter in particular can become a real issue if people can no longer focus on life. But, and there are things, it's just like, yeah, I'm influenced by whatever health propaganda to brush my teeth. We are all influenced by things outside of us. We can't be solitary creatures. And it is, in fact, the belief that you're a solitary creature who no one can get to. That is the way. Well, what about what you just said, Bern? Well, listen to the subtlety of what I'm saying. Is that I know, because there are times I was deeply involved with social contagion, like I said, back in the mid-70s. And it is coming out of that. I often feel that the experience I had, it's kind of like I'm a person who lost an arm, but I'm real good with the other one. Because I realize what the world really is like, and that is that there are these deep psychological problems that people have, and there are also people trying to manipulate our social psychology, and it's never never easier to manipulate someone's psychology than when they think they control everything. I don't think I control everything. So that's why I'm good at sales resistance, because it's kind of like I understand when people do. But there comes a point, obviously we have to live in a social world, which involves us doing a certain amount of social things, and some of those things are kind of contagious, fine. Like I said, like laughing or yawning, as long as they're held in check, that's fine. As long as you can kind of recognize that. We all say, how come I'm yawning when someone else is yawning? But what happens is there are social contagions that turn into a pathology of empathy. And what do I mean? Is that all of these things involve a kind of empathy. That is to say, you start saying, why do teenagers usually, sometimes it's earlier, but usually people in their teen years start smoking? It's because they're around other people and they want to empathize with them. And some people say they want to be cool, but I think it's deeper than that. I think that it's not that we want to be liked, but we want to be like, we want to emulate. But it has to do with that empathic thing that comes out in even the most rudimentary forms of social contagion. But the pathological version of empathy, we're seeing very clearly in the woke movements of our own time. Because what they're saying is, anyone who doesn't do these social justice things, and social justice all by itself is a phrase loaded with empathic relationships. How could you not? I remember having a whole discussion once with little Steve Van Zandt from Bruce Springsteen's band. I saw him in a movie theater and we got to talking. And I started talking with him about his whole Sun City project, which was about, it was anti-apartheid and stuff. And I said, well, that's really great, except the problem is you make the whole issue seem so simple when it's not. It never is. And so you have to resort to propaganda to get your point across. And one of the ways we feel propaganda is when you feel, if I disagreed, bam, I would suddenly feel the wrath of the society as a whole. And he said, yeah, I know, but what can I do? And so the propaganda feeds on the social contagions, and the social contagions can easily turn into pathologies, illnesses of empathy. So obviously, empathy is good. And here's the weird thing. So then on the reaction side, and I was seeing this on the right wing more, there are people who said, empathy is bad, empathy is terrible, because they're seeing the people on the left weaponize it, which is not the response. I mean, empathy is like this. I'm walking down the street and I see someone asking for money. And so I say, oh my God, they need the money. And so I pull out whatever I have in my pocket. I give it to them. Fine. Then I walk down the street a little further and I see someone else asking for money. So I go, oh no. So I go to a bank machine and pull out more money and I give them money. And I walk down the street and eventually I empty the bank, because there are so many people asking for money. I empty the bank of all of the resources I have and give it to people out of empathy. And then in the end, I'm left on the street myself because of empathy. Now that's an extreme example, but the point is this, is that we can't get rid of empathy. My answer to the homeless people on the street is pick one or two in the area. I have different people in different parts of the city here in Tbilisi, because you can't give it to everyone. And I am giving it to just a few people who I will see over and over and form a human relationship with. And other people should do the same, but I can't be everyone and do everything. But it is that guilt we feel, which the pathological version of empathy feeds on. And it is the pathological version of empathy which creates an equally pathological rejection of empathy. You can't reject empathy or compassion. You have to keep these. You have to remain human. I mean, basically, how many of the words of Jesus revolve around trying to understand someone, to love your neighbor as you love yourself, which I've heard it misinterpreted as, well, first I have to just get to love myself, which I just have no response to that, except that's the problem. You're trying to love yourself, and that's not what Jesus was talking about. But nevertheless, okay. I'm done. Put a fork in me. Thanks for listening. I just had these things on my mind, and I hope they meant something to you. Because I think about these things all the time. And what's underneath? What's moving us underneath? Not only what's moving us, but what's preying upon us. And I just hope something of what I'm saying will basically help strengthen you to find truthful answers in a dark world. Jacques Ellul in his book on hope, which if you're ever super depressed, I recommend Jacques Ellul's Hope in Time of Abandonment as one of the best things to read. Because he says, one of the points he makes in that book is that it isn't until you see how hopeless the situation really is that you can actually have hope. So, get to the point where you see how hopeless it is, and then look for the hope which is there. Because it is there. God has always left us hope. Well, from Tbilisi, this is Bern saying, thanks for spending a bit of time with me. Droabit. We will meet again.
A people without history is not redeemed from time. For history is a pattern of timeless moments.